Dr. Tuval-Mashiach is a clinical psychologist. She's an associate professor of psychology based at Bar-Ilan University in Tel Aviv. She's the director of the clinical psychology program. She's also head of research and development of the Community Services Unit, NATAL, which is the Israeli Center for Victims of National Trauma. And she's a clinical advisor and board member of the Patton Veteran Project in New York. Thomas Hübl is a spiritual teacher. He has a growing international outreach. He's been teaching now for about 15 years. And he is bringing a very profound mystical practice and teaching from the long line of mysticism, but really expressed in a very contemporary way. And one of the many core features of his teaching is that he works both with the highest levels of our consciousness, and at the same time, he works with the more hidden, wounded, traumatized shadow parts of us. And in the past, he has organized and led some very big events, for instance, with Germans and Israelis working together to address collective trauma. And my first question to each of you, and maybe we'll start with Rivka, is in your work, Rivka, with trauma and communities in particular, because I know you work with a lot of communities, what would you say are the main symptoms of trauma and also the main consequences that you see in the collective communities that you work with?
So maybe I would start with the idea of the narrative that I believe encompasses everything that we see both in individuals and in communities. But it's easier to start with this question as the first question because basically that's my starting point. I believe that the way that we conceive the world, both as individuals and as communities and as cultures, is through the narrative lens. And maybe the best way to describe it is to think of our lives as developing as a story. And when we think of lives as stories, so it's easy to think about it as an unfolding book with different chapters, where now we're somewhere in the middle of the book or the writing of the book. So we can look backward to see some previous chapters in our life, and we can look forward to the next chapters in our lives, or the ones that we imagine or dream of or plan or hope for. And we're now in the present. So this framework is really very helpful, and I believe very, very creative to think of individuals' lives in terms of the narratives that they have, the narratives that they tell themselves about themselves, the narratives they tell about themselves to others. And what I do when I work with communities, I borrow this concept of the narrative to think of narratives of communities or narrative identity of communities, because I think there are some very interesting parallels to think of the narrative, both for individuals and communities.
Mm-hmm. And so this means that when you work on that, you start to bring that narrative into the conscious awareness of the community, and then maybe also to reframe that narrative in order to create some more conscious awareness of the process behind it. Or how do you work with that narrative?
I can work both ways. I can work without even bringing it up front. It's enough if you interview, let's say we talk at the individual level, for example, because it's easier to understand it at the beginning. Let's say that you work with someone who's traumatized. You can ask him about his past. You can ask him how he thinks his past impacts his reaction to the trauma now. You can ask him in what ways the trauma impacts is dreams for the future? In what ways it changed his plans for himself, for example? All these questions, a question that I ask from a narrative perspective, even if the individual himself is not aware of me working with a narrative. Now, we can also bring it forward and discuss the narrative. And sometimes when I do psychoeducation, I talk with the patient or with the client about this narrative. And I say, well, if we think of your life as a narrative, what you tell me is that the trauma really created a rupture in the story, because people keep saying, I used to be this person and now the trauma changed me and I'm not myself anymore. So when we speak about that, we borrow, or we're bringing the narrative idea, and then we can discuss it. We can talk about the storyline or the plot that has changed. We speak about some ideas that Michael White, who was one of the developers of the narrative approach, spoke about unique outcomes, about those parts or chapters in our life story that we never pursued because we chose a different path, and we can go back and choose them now. For example, if a person says, I used to be an athlete and the trauma changed it for me and now I cannot run, we go back to the age 20 where it chose this path, and we see that it could have chosen another path. And now we can go back and maybe choose that path instead of the one that was cut or stopped because of the trauma. Now, having said that, I think that some of these ideas can be transferred or translated in a way to working with communities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I understand this now more. Mm-hmm.
So Thomas, would you like to say something about, again, the first question, because you've done so much work, particularly in Germany, for instance, how you would articulate the primary symptoms and consequences, let's say, of World War II, that are still very present somehow in the German collective field?
Yeah, basically, I mean, here is just my kind of empiric research. This is what I observed throughout the work that I did. And basically, when we started with the groups, I wasn't even looking to work with the collective dynamics primarily. Primarily, we were looking to do some, like, also transpersonal work and some individual shadow work. But then basically in almost every group that lasted longer than 3 or 4 days, I observed the same rhythm of a collective process, like a collective emergence of collective shadow or trauma material within many people of a group. And then the more I saw it, and I saw it once and then twice and 3 times, and I said, okay, something is really surfacing here that wants to be seen and more explored. And so in our work, I mean, to give a bit of a frame, we are looking how to combine, let's say, the latest or the work of therapy psychology with the knowledge of the mystical traditions. And so when we look at the mystical traditions in the refinement of presence and the discernment within our perception, we see that there's a lot more information than appears maybe in my daily conscious awareness. And so it's like a higher resolution onto a screenshot and on the computer screen. And so when we combine those two, we see, okay, relational work, like my capacity to relate to people, to situations, to environments, to culture, and the spiritual work, which has a lot to do with increasing my presence and the present awareness in the given moment, and kind of an inner connection to kind of a higher source of creativity. I saw that actually in the in the experience of the physical, emotional, mental, and maybe spiritual landscape, there was a strong kind of release of a certain material that was not part of the personal story of some of the people in the group. So they suddenly had a kind of a flooding of scenes that they had seen, of emotions, of stuff that came up. For some people had a connection to their family story, but for some people not. And so my interest now is to find out more about the hidden unconscious aspects of collective traumatization that actually walks with us as an unconscious tension all the time, and that only surfaces in certain moments or gets triggered throughout the circumstances in certain moments, but actually affects our life moment to moment, often without us knowing. And then through processes, awareness processes, it comes out. But that when we work a lot with the coherence between my physical, my emotional, and my mental experience, if we reduce it now to just the three, and we see that actually when I read the news and I receive, like I read the papers in the morning, or I go to the internet and I look on CNN and I see, okay, what happens right now in Syria while we talk? And then the news that I read land in me in a certain way. And I believe that many of the news, especially the ones that we call, I don't know, difficult or problematic or negative, are landing in us through the filter of those past collective traumatization, individual or collective traumas. And so I'm very interested, how can a culture at all develop a capacity to be a responsible global social witness without, or how do we create that? And the only way to do that is that we will need to surface a lot of the past, a lot of the collective trauma that we carry in us. And that gives us the capacity to at all relate to what's happening right now in the world as a grown-up human being with my capacities. And so all of that was the reason why we thought, wow, we need like the Pocket Project, like a more systematic approach. And this conversation now is the first one in a series of conversations that we lead with many people that are kind of professionals or experts or have high competencies in their field, to explore from different fields. Like when you are an archaeologist and you take out the sand of an area and then you reveal a sunken city. And I think we are about to reveal more and more in our time about collective trauma, and which gives us the capacity back to relate to our current political, social, and economical circumstances. And I know that there's much more to say. I want to keep it short because I want to hear more of you, Rivka. But that's basically how we started the whole thing, is that we saw a similar process with a certain level of belonging, which means intimacy, and becoming, which means movement in a group, so that it kept resurfacing just with 100 or 150 different participants, the same process. And therefore, I think, the rest of the work that we did is an effect of it. But I think that the belonging and the becoming are crucial factors in revealing those hidden mechanisms. Yeah. But maybe we continue, and I want to hear a bit more of Rivka's experience.
It's very interesting what you say, Thomas, because maybe one concept that I want to bring into the discussion is that the narrative idea rests on the understanding or the perception that narrative expresses or in a way represents identity. So when we speak about, okay, that's my life story, that's my narrative, it's not just what happened to me, but it's much deeper. It goes all the way down to everything that creates my identity, myself, the whole, I wouldn't say personality, because it's even more than personality, but it's everything that we think of when we speak about identity. And why is it relating to what you said, Thomas? Because part of what the narrative approach says is that each one of us, even before we belong to a group, each one of us has within himself some unknown myths that he holds that he's not necessarily aware of. It may be some family myths about, what happened in the family 20 or 50 or even 100 years ago, and it is not even sure where he knows it from. But there's a family myth about, that can be a very small myth about, how your mother and father dated at the beginning, who initiated the relationship. So it may become a family myth, but like that, we all are part of our culture myth. Like, for example, when we started working with the Afro-Americans communities in Chicago a few years back, it was only after we met with them and we spoke with them and we heard about the traumas that are ongoing where they live in some of the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago. And exactly as you described, when we spoke with several people after a few days, we felt that what they have as their shared myth or story is dating back to the times of slavery, to the times where they were slaves of the white people, and that a lot of the pain that they feel and experience now, even though they weren't slaves themselves, but it goes back to some collective history that they're part of. And I agree with you that when you make it conscious, when you become aware of it, it makes it easier. I wouldn't say it solves the problem. It makes it easier to start. First, it gives you meaning, or it gives you a sense of something, and then it's easier to cope with it, to start working with it.
Right. That's beautiful. And that, like, and that, well, I mean, what I'm very interested in is, and maybe you can share a little bit of your experience around that, is, so when I look at the world of today, we see, I mean, just recently there was the election in the US and there were many other things. It's like, how do we come as human beings to a kind of an inner state that we are really responsive from our cores to the current situation. And as you said, often the current situation is overshadowed by even a long-lasting past that actually makes me feel the way I feel, that I think the way I think, and I experience the other the way I experience the other. So there are two things that I'm very interested in. The one is, what are collective regulatory functions, how a culture agrees upon suppressing a collective trauma. So if an individual suppresses in the nervous system, there are certain functions in an individual system or organism, how we suppress trauma or how we deal with trauma. But I'm also interested, what are the collective regulation mechanisms that we agree upon that as a culture? So how does a culture agree upon suppressing the Holocaust? How do we manage this in the collective psyche? So that's one question. And the other question is also, how how do we, or is there a possibility to restore the function that when I read about Syria or I read about anything that happens right now in the world that we label as difficult to digest, how can I come to a state of living that I find a vulnerable response to the state of the world that I live in? So I'm a global citizen, let's say, and I find a response to my community, to what happens with my neighbor, but also to what happens in the country beside us. So in different circles of intimacy, to find a kind of a human responsiveness. So those are two questions that I'm walking with, and I think also the Pocket Project is walking with. So maybe you have something out of your experience that relates to one or the other.
It's interesting. I hear you, and I think that there is a very interesting contradiction between what on the surface we see when we treat clients who are traumatized, and between what you speak about. But I think it's a somewhat an artificial contradiction. I'll just explain. When someone comes to the clinic after he underwent a serious trauma, and that can be also a natural disaster. It doesn't have to be a human-made trauma or disaster. But I just want to mention that when traumas are man-made, usually it's much more difficult to cope with and to recover from. But let's say it's a robbery or even a car accident, and someone comes to the clinic after a few months and he says, I can't go back to my life. So usually what we see is that this person, what he says is that he lost connection with his past. Because he used to know himself in a way, let's say as a creative person, as a functioning person, as someone who can concentrate, and all the symptoms now of PTSD, of the post-traumatic stress disorder, really change him. And he feels that usually that he lost connection with his past. And what you say, Thomas, is that at the same time, and this is why it's not really a contradiction, but at the same time, he goes back, even if without knowing, to a different past of him, which has to do with the myths and maybe a history that he's not even aware of his family, of the way that, prices were held, and in the ways that his nation or his culture used to take care of such traumas and crises. So in a way, he loses contact with his own personal past, but at the same time, he's leaning more about a more collective past. So that's one association that I had. I can maybe elaborate more about what we see because I think that these are the more interesting things that we see when communities cope with traumas. And this is not strictly an empirical study. These are just thoughts that I have based on my experience with individuals, but I think that it's interesting to think of when we think of communities. When individuals go through a serious trauma, usually we see that there are certain things, I wouldn't even call them symptoms, but there are certain characteristics that we usually can say, okay, they characterize the traumatized person. And these are, for example, that someone stops dreaming about the future. I'm not talking about night dreams. I'm talking about plans and dreams and aspirations for the future. So in a way, someone is just caught without past and without a future. It's just living day to day now, struggling. But many times people say, well, there's no future for me. And also they say things like, I'm going to die very young. The future is going to be very short for me. And we don't hear it from normal people. We hear it from people who were traumatized. And if you take this in a parallel way to communities, we sometimes see something parallel in communities who are very traumatized, where there are no dreams for the future. The community stops dreaming. You can see it in the Afro-Americans, where young people say, well, I'm going to die. It's going to take a year. It's going to take 3 years, but I'm not going to be mature. I'm not going to be adult. So what's the matter? So it doesn't really matter if I'll die tomorrow or in 2 years. So that this feeling of a short future, of not being able to dream, this is one aspect. Another aspect is what we call in a strict way, we call it the symptom of avoidance, which means that you close yourself from the surrounding, you close yourself from going out, you start avoid things that you used to enjoy. So we can start thinking about the way it affects communities, because if as a community you avoid new people, you get close within yourself because it's safer to be with people like you. So the estrangement between groups, intercultural groups, it gets bigger. So, and the hate. And also there's many times, especially when the trauma relates to war. So what happens is that the group wants to strengthen its relationship inside, so they find a common enemy to hate. Okay, these are processes that we know from group work, that in a way it makes the group stronger if they find someone else from the outside to hate, because there's a common denominator now. So this in a way may be a sign or a symbol of avoidance, because you don't have to cope with someone who speaks a different language or thinks differently from you. So this is the way I think it's interesting to play with the translation of individual symptoms to the community level. I just gave you a few examples, but we can think about it more.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. Sounds great. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Rivka, I remember very, very well when we first met you in your office, and you were talking about, I think, particularly your experience in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And you started to talk about, well, my question is about what are the things that begin to create support, maybe eventually some healing in communities. And I remember you talked about like relationships, and maybe it would be very interesting if we move on to that, how you both see, you know, what are the qualities, what are the functions that begin to work with trauma in a more collective way in a community.
So these are again things that I think we can borrow from my and others' ideas about what works at the individual level. And there are 3 concepts that I want to talk about. One is the coherence of the narrative. And the idea is that when the trauma occurs, it breaks the narrative and it creates a rupture. So there is an incoherence in the narrative of the individual. And in a way, there is an incoherence in the narrative of the community. So on the other hand, if we want to help a community to heal, I think we should be able to help the community to recreate the coherence of its story. For example, as Thomas and me discussed a few minutes ago, if we help the community relate back to its common past and shared past and see how it affects how the community works now and how it may connect to how the community works in the future. So we help them reorganize or restructure or reconstruct the narrative in a way which is more coherent and more effective for them. This is one aspect. The second aspect is the aspect of agency. And agency speaks about our feeling that we are in control of our lives. And this is something that is really, really being hard when we go through a trauma, because trauma is basically about something that we didn't plan, we didn't expect, and we couldn't control. So the remedy for this is to try to give some control to the person, or in a way to the community. This is why, for example, one of the ideas that we really very much emphasize is that the healing should start from the community, not from people, not the professionals who come from the outside and give the community all the, you know, the medical and the professional assistance, because that will keep them without control and without agency. So, for example, just to give an example, what the idea in Chicago is that my organization is not coming to treat the people in Chicago, but we are coming there to help them build their own trauma center. They will be the therapists, they will be the helpline, they will do anything that they need, because this is part of recreating agency. And the last concept is the concept of meaning. And we know that following trauma, when people are able to start finding new areas of fields or places where they can find meaning for what they do, for what they feel, for how they function, then this is part of the healing. And working in order to help your community is such a thing. Supporting others is such a thing, and this is why social support and creating connections and strengthening community ties is for itself not only supporting because it's good to be supported and support, but also because it gives people meaning, and that's for itself is a healing thing.
Beautiful. This sounds great. Yeah, I think this relates very much to the, like in our work, we call it the becoming and the belonging, like how to restore the belonging in myself to myself, in myself to the community, and how to, and you said it in your own words in different terminologies, but it's interesting that when you are cut from your roots, when you don't know where you come from, so you actually don't know where you're going to. So you're also cut from your future. In our work, we say when somebody, like in a trauma, contracts, so you're actually losing your future, because all you cut yourself from the future pull, and then all you have is the tools of the past that got you where you are. And so that's restoring the belonging and the safety, the security, the like agency and the autonomy, give a base to the becoming, or to the original movement. We call the soul, like the kind of inner, the hidden light is the motivation or the deep interest or the drive for, you know, to become in life. And so how when we restore the belonging, we have enough energy to want to become, to go to the future and have again a vision for life and have something to aspire to. And the kind of in different words, I hear similar restoration movements, like how to restore the belonging and how to restore the movement or the becoming as a healing process. Mm-hmm. And how important is the community building and the kind of being part of a supportive network for that. Yeah, great. But it's amazing to hear this from you, and also through your experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that maybe I would just add that sometimes what we see, and I think we see it, and that maybe that's the tragic thing, because I think that even without professional help, or even without the definitions that I give or that we discuss, I think that there is a natural capacity for healing. And I think many of the things that we discuss now in a professional way, people do it anyway. So people would try to reconnect to the past and to their support systems because it's natural for them to do it when they're hurt. But what's tragic is that sometimes some people really insist on relating back to the same story that they had. Like they say, okay, my way of reconnecting myself to my story is to go back to exactly where I was and to continue exactly where I stood a minute before it happened, and to continue the same storyline as it should have been. But the trauma changes things, and it really cannot go the same way. So right. What I'm saying is maybe is somewhat contradicting, because I say we do have to reconnect to our past, but the understanding is that we're going to reconnect in order to take a different path from now on, because trauma makes it usually impossible to continue as it was before. And sometimes that's where we have to help people, because they insist on going back to the same story. They are not willing to change. And the reality is different. The reality is that they change. And I think it's very true about nations and about collective communities, where I don't want to go into politics, but if every nation insists on what he deserved from, 2,000 years ago, and is not willing to understand that, because the reality has changed, maybe you have to be more flexible about the way your narrative as a group should take direction now. So what we see is that sometimes people just get stuck with their old narratives and are not willing to open it up to new opportunities. And trauma plays a major role in it. And as healers and as professionals, I think that's sometimes where our role is, to help open up the narratives to new opportunities.
Right, that's beautifully said. Also beautifully said that the trauma really is a deep impact on our path, and that there is not the same place to come back to. That's deeply, because also the trauma can be turned into wisdom, and then we miss the whole part of the wisdom. That's beautifully said. And also I think that when the trauma healing really leads to a healthy self-contact, like that we reopen a vulnerability within ourselves, so then we touch in a way the river of our own being. And I think in our own being, I think then from our own being, we will feel that the trauma really changed our life, and we will feel what is actually the new path that the trauma co-created with our original whatever being or story or narrative. Yeah, that's beautiful. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's the real challenge, because just think that when, think of yourself, or I can think of myself, that when we are in pain, when we're really, really in pain, the last thing that we can do is think open. We're not open-minded. We cannot be creative because we're in pain. So what we usually tend to do is avoid all new things, try to stick to the things that we already know, and expose ourselves to as few as less, new things or new stories. We would like to stick to what we are familiar with and what we already know, because we're in pain. So it's hard for us to concentrate. We don't sleep well. We're alert and we're nervous, because this is part of what trauma does to us. So the whole context is not a context which is very productive for a change, for wisdom. So it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. This is why people and communities tend to get stuck in their old stories, because this is the tendency to say, I don't want to hear anything. I just want to stay where I was, exactly where I was, and please don't talk too much to me. And the challenge is to be able to move from this stage when you're a little less in pain, and to be able then to open up to, okay, what's now? What new story I can hear now? What new people I can meet now, etc., etc.
Right, and that also is really then a challenge, because the more collective trauma we have, it literally reduces our capacity to envision like a new dream of a new world, like a narrative of a world. Where do we go as a global community facing also global challenges, and how we need to collaborate on a global level in order to solve stuff like climate change and other things. So that's definitely a big thing that you said now, how that influences our function in that.
Yeah. That's very true, because I wouldn't say everything, but most of what I said is based on what happens when we're exposed to single trauma. Now, if we think of many people in the world, many communities in the world exposed to trauma on a continuous basis or ongoing basis, so it doesn't even give you the time to heal, because you're always, you either experience trauma, or you prepare yourself to a trauma, or you're in the middle of a trauma, so you don't have time to these processes. So
right.
So these processes usually can start when there's some quiet, when you're in peace, or when you really, really understand that you want to, end this trauma cycle. But some communities are not able to stop this. They're stuck within a cycle.
Thank you, Rivka. It's wonderful to hear you speak. I'd love to ask you two questions, and then also see what dialogue there can be. They're very different questions, so see which one you want to go with. I'd love to ask you what role you see that religion or faith or spirituality can play in a healing journey for individuals and communities. That's one question. As I said, I watched your talk on trauma narratives, and there was one sentence that really jumped out at me amongst many, but you talked about the burden of listening to a trauma story as a practitioner.
Maybe I'll start with the first one. I think it's complicated. I think religion, in the narrow sense, we know that it plays usually a positive role in helping individuals cope with the impact of trauma. This is the short answer. The deeper answer is that I think it can really work in many ways, and not all of them are positive. I think cultures and communities can make use of their religions and their faiths in a way that can either be healing or can contribute to a deeper level of trauma. So it depends how the community uses the religion. If they uses the right values in order to really lift themselves up and heal the community from the trauma, or they use religion in order to say, we are above everybody else, we know that all others, are the ones that should be punished, and we are the only ones that should be thriving because we know everything the best way as a religion. So I think, religion per se is a great source, and faith is a great source. We know that people who have faith, and it doesn't really matter if they are Jews or Christians or they practice any other religion, they cope better than people who do not have any religious belief. But as a whole, communities sometimes use religions in terrible ways. So this is why my answer to that question is complicated. And the second one I can talk about for an hour itself. I think it's a huge thing to be able to listen to trauma. I think it is a burden to those who listen, whether it's the family members of those who's traumatized, whether it's the clinician, whether it's the public. But, and I can explain why. It's very difficult to be exposed to things that really traumatize you now as a listener, and you don't choose to listen, and you sometimes hear the details that you don't want to hear, and then you cannot sleep, and then you have to go back to your office and hear it from other traumatized people. So it is burdening, and it may be sometimes overburdening. But on the other hand, it's maybe the most astonishing thing is that the listening is exactly what is healing, because when someone who was traumatized is able to really share his story, and he knows and he sees that someone is listening to him, it's healing. It's as simple as that, because first, because he is being credited for his story, not even saying you're right or you're wrong, just being listened to, and seeing someone who looks in your eyes and say, I hear you, I hear your pain, I hear your suffering, I hear that you're coping, and I credit it by being with you, without being judgmental about what you did and what you didn't do, and whether you're guilty or you should have done this or that or that. So it's a challenge for us, the listeners, to be able to help ourselves, save ourselves, take care of our mental and psychological hygiene, and able to listen, because that's what heals. Listening is healing.
That's very beautiful. Also, when you say that simply the restoration of the relation, like the listening in itself is a very simple act, is restoring a relation, and relation is often that which gets hurt in the trauma, and that it's actually a very simple human act, that it has a very strong power, and but you said also one small sentence that when you feel that somebody listens with interest, like it's not just a kind of a listening and I'm waiting until you finished what you tell me. But actually you're really interested in what I'm telling you, and that human interest creates connection, and that's beautiful.
Yeah.
So that's basically also a hope that on the one hand something very simple is able to have actually a huge impact, and it's basically a very human heart quality that has a strong impact.
I can tell you, Thomas, that, I think that in the maybe now 25 years that I'm a therapist, I come to learn that listening, like in its full meaning, is not so easy. It's not so easy to really listen. I'm not talking about sitting with someone. I'm talking about really, really listening, maybe in a way which is more similar to the way that you speak about presence and being. When I speak about really listening, I speak about really being there with the other person,
right,
without judgment, and it's very difficult, without immediately thinking, why did he do it? Why didn't he respond this way, the other way? Without wanting to defend myself if he speaks about something that relates to, to me or to my nation or to my, let's say when Palestinians and Israelis speak, immediately we have this tendency to say, well, it's not like you say it, it's not like you tell the story. So really being able to listen is a great lesson. I think I'm still learning it.
Yeah, that's beautiful, because actually so the listening on the one hand is such a simple, it sounds like a very simple thing, but on the other hand, it's one of the most complex and I think one of the highest wisdom capacities also.
Right.
At the same time. Yeah, right. It's beautiful. And
Yeah.
I think that's also where, Nicholas, your two questions actually come together, because I very much agree with what you said in your answer, Rivka, to the religion, and that I believe in order to come to a state of really listening, the many qualities of a true spiritual practice, like developing a state of presence, developing a state of inner connection, really developing compassion and love and clarity and discernment. And so there are so many qualities that a spiritual practice can give us that literally serve as resources in trauma situations. But as you said, is when the religious identities come into play, and when it's more us versus them, and when the trauma actually becomes the clustered community value that is us versus them, then it really becomes also difficult. But that the true spiritual practice, like the inner capacity of presencing and space and silence and connection and movement, so there are so many qualities that actually function as beautiful resources. And then the spiritual practice is really a benefit, and I think that's also why you said that people can cope better when they have some sort of inner practice or a bigger context that they are part of, that it's not just about the personal me. That,
right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, definitely. We know that you know, one of my studies dealt with a community that was forced to relocate from their houses a little more than 10 years ago. They used to live in the Gaza Strip. There was a Jewish population that was forced to leave and moved to live in other parts of Israel. And we definitely could see that people who are strongly attached to the community and moved with their communities, they fared better than those who were more individualistic, and they lived there, but they weren't so much part of the community. Because when you live as a community, you have a space to mourn the relocation. You have people who know your history, and you don't have to start it all over again and say who you are, because people are with you and you move together as a community. So all the processes of healing and recovery and mourning and bereavement, they're easier.
Right, beautiful. Yes, so I think it's a great conversation. It's so lovely to listen to you and also hear from your research and experience how you deepen your understanding of also collective trauma.
It's interesting for me to talk to you too.